Добро пожаловать!
Welcome to the discussion, exploration of cosmos. The entire universe is full of perfect creatures. Today we continue the discussions at the intersection of art and science in St. Petersburg. This is the program of international meeting, performances, presentations, and that unites scientists and artists, as well as the wide audience. The LASER was founded in 2008, and today it counts 47 sites all over the world. It is aimed to the fostering of cultural environment and international dialogue. How did the universe come to be that way? Where did it come from? What's dark matter? Could there be a universe of dark matter which is a parallel to ours? Maybe it is not proven, but it is still the scientific challenge. The exploration of cosmos is infinite reign of exploration, and it is free of time and space and provides a great space for us for exploration and art. The art is the reflection of our understanding of the universe and makes us think of more questions of larger scale, like where are we from, where are we going, and are there anybody else in the universe besides us? Today we are going to discuss the participation of dogs in the first of suborbital flights in the Soviet media about tardigrades and their survival in extreme conditions, including the outer space, and the fact that people are vulnerable, trusting, and masters of a really small spot in space, but about the creatures that feed from the energy from dark holes, black holes, and also discuss the hypothesis of interplanetary spread of civilizations and what lessons could we learn from this travel of reason to the universe. Our first guest is Matthew Lee, who is a poet and also quantitative hedge fund manager. He holds a PhD in physics from UCLA, where he studied theoretical elementary particles and also nonlinear dynamics. He has dreamt about black holes since he was a child, and he feels that everybody should have a pet tardigrade. Matthew, you have the floor.
Thank you. Spasiba, Natalia. Just getting set up here. So I'm going to talk about space creatures, of course. So first let's talk, we can't talk about space creatures without first talking about space. The universe, it's big, it's much larger than the size of a grapefruit, and it can hold 10 to the 82 grapefruits in them, which is quite a bit of grapefruits, so that's very large. It's cold. At the deepest parts of outer space, it's absolute zero or close to it, around minus 270, 273 degrees. Between planets, kind of near a sun, sort of in our solar system, it's about minus 73 degrees centigrade. And it's very harsh. There's 200 to 400 times the radiation as Earth in around our solar system. So for planets, since everything we know that has life or that we can conceive of probably is on a planet or starts on a planet, there are mass extinction events. For Earth, it's every 50 to 60 million years from an asteroid impact. And it can also occur from a nearby supernova. The radiation could wipe out the whole planet, life on the planet. Our own sun will die as a red giant. The diameter of the sun will increase and engulf the Earth. So these are events that every so often wipe out all life on pretty much all planets. So for a civilization to persist on a planet, of people, of creatures like us, which are rather fragile, you need to be spacefaring. So we need to get off the planet and live in space. But that's not the only answer. So there is the tardigrade, which are about 1 millimeter in length. They can survive to absolute zero, which is amazing. The temperature of space, the deepest depths of space, they can survive it. They can take 1,000 times the radiation on Earth. They can survive pressures 6 times greater than the deepest oceans on Earth, which is incredible. It'll squish animals flat. They can handle no water, no oxygen for periods of time. And extreme environments. And they can survive the pure vacuum of space. It's a perfect creature. They can survive nearby supernovas and extinction level asteroid events. When there's no water or they're in trouble, they pull their heads and legs into a ball, and they get rid of about 97% of their body mass in water. And their cells are surrounded by very intense antioxidants, which also protects them from radiation. And the longest known state of this, where they've been revived back to life, has been 125 years. And they are already on the moon. An Israeli lunar lander crashed on the moon a couple of years ago that carried thousands of tardigrades. So they're probably in this desiccated state, dehydrated state on the moon right now, waiting to be revived. A few drops of water will bring them back to life. So the lowly tardigrade will also persist. I'm going to digress a little and talk about deep undersea hydrothermal vents. So they grow these. So they come into existence due to volcanic action beneath the surface of the Earth. Water will seep in somewhere, get heated by the magma, and shoot up through vents. And it shoots up a lot of chemicals embedded in the Earth's crust. So at the top right is a picture of one of these vents. It's boiling water that comes out, and it's rich in hydrogen sulfide and methane. At these depths, there's no sunlight. It's essentially zero sunlight. So photosynthesis does not occur. Everything we know about on the surface of the Earth runs on photosynthesis, even in the ocean. Ultimately, it's through seaweeds that convert light into energy. But at these depths, that does not occur. We discovered there is life there. And at the bottom part of that vent, you see these red-tipped white long things. Those are tapeworms. They've evolved to tube worms. They've evolved to exist through chemosynthesis and not photosynthesis. And the picture below that is a creature that's in the same family as shrimp. This particular type of creature grows normally to 3 centimeters. At these depths, they grow to 30 centimeters long. So there's a lot of gigantism where at these depths, creatures grow to be much larger than normal depths. So there's a whole ecosystem that evolved around these deep undersea vents to convert the energy from these vents to live off of. Now let's talk about another energy vent, which is a black hole. They create extreme, intense sources of energy. The top right is a picture of one, an illustration of one. These energy jets shoot very far off. They can even span galaxies. It's very intense. Black holes also evaporate through Hawking radiation. They give off some energy as well. You can increase the energy that's released in a black hole if you play with the magnetic field lines, if you manipulate them, if you disconnect them and reconnect them in the right way, you can get it to give you more energy. So perhaps there can be creatures that evolve to live off of this type of energy source. around this energy vent, the black hole. And maybe they can manipulate the magnetic fields themselves consciously to increase the energy output. And maybe they need to be multidimensional so that they can survive the gravitational forces in our three-dimensional universe. So perhaps there are some giant energy creatures as well that maybe live off of the nutrients of these black holes. So I would say the perfect creatures in my universe are the tardigrade, spacefaring peoples, and black hole energy vent creatures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mattis. Большое спасибо. Наш следующий выступающий Olesya Turkina.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Alessa Turken, who is the senior researcher of the Russian Museum and associate professor of St. Petersburg State University. She has been a full member of the Russian northern branch of the Russian Federation of Cosmonautics. Since 1997, she has collaborated with the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles, and since 2012, she is the curator in Slovenia. She's been curated countless exhibitions of contemporary art, including specialized shows, and has written numerous articles. Alessa, you have the word. Thank you. I hope that you can see you well. And I would, Matthew, thank you very much. I am all for the tardigrade, and I believe that they are perfect creatures. I am even willing to do them pet, and even my domestic master, the tardigrade, but I don't know if I would be able to take care of them, and I would like to give me a consultation as to how I could make a tardigrade to survive. I'm coming back to Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who is rightfully called the father of Russian cosmonautics, because his space research allowed the human being break away from the Earth, and the first part of this research was in 1903, and this here is the edition of 1914. But the important thing that this edition came to the outer space and was signed by Kubasov, that was the member of Apollon-Soyuz mission. Tsiolkovsky promoted the space travel, and he believed that the future will come here and now. But if we come to the next type of creature after tardigrades, that would go to suborbital flights, and that was the domain of Sergei Korolev, designer-in-chief, a truly legendary person who started working on this in 1930s. Then he was repressed and sent to Gulag. He survived by the miracle and worked in the concentration camps and created the model of the interplanetary rocket that would overcome the force of space, worst generation. But the important thing that both Tsiolkovsky and Korolev did not consider rockets to be a weapon, even though it was all over the world, especially during the Cold War, that was applied to the war industry in order to defeat the overseas enemy. But Sergei Korolev dreamt of sending a living creature to space, and since the end of 40s he started the research, and he would send to suborbital flights dogs, 2 at a time at first, then they would land, and the parameters were researched. Unfortunately, not all of that ended well, and now you can see the cart the catapulta card from the Museum of Cosmonautics in Kaluga. This was the part of spaceship that the dog was supposed to come back, and the problem was top secret for a long time, and it was made public knowledge only when a man-orbited flight, flight was planned. But prior to that, the true stars were introduced, Kozявka, Linda, and Malishka, that you can see here. And you can see that in 1957, the dog named Laika was launched into the space. And this is the fragment of the film of Slavinsky and Chigoryan that became the symbol of the heroic feat for the Soviet Union as far as the Western citizens of other countries. And it became, for them, however, it became the symbol of cruelty, because nobody asked the dog whether they would like to do the space travel, and they sent them at the time, but they were still unable to bring them back. And so this linked between the two systems concerning the value of life, not just human life, but the life of the dog, became the main issue. Because at first in the Soviet Union they didn't know how to present Laika's image, except that it was photographed and put on the pack of cigarettes as the first creature in the orbit. But when in the Pravda newspaper they said that the warm creature, warm-blooded creature ended up in orbit, and only later she was named Laika. And only later we learned about its destiny, and because she died within first hours of the flight because of the overheating, because that system was not thought through. And only after that they started treating her image as a hero, as a heroine. She was on chocolate, she was on cigarettes, she was, its image was taken to 3 Soviet satellites, and even the founders of the source art, artist Komar and Melamid, created a painting, the picture in 1972 about the cigarette label Laika. And only 51 years after the Laika flight, her monument was erected at the Institute of Military Medicine. And then there were candies and chocolate Laika. Here you can see the first satellite, the Sputnik, and Belka, and Strelka, and Cherkovich, and Valentina Tereshkova, and Gagarin, and Titov, and other cosmonauts. Also, this image of heroic Soviet dogs was the subject of propaganda for in children's books. And here you can indeed see their portraits of those dogs. And of course, in 1960, after Laika was sent with one-way ticket to outer space, they said that they would never send any other creature to the outer space without the assurance of their return. And it was only 1960 that Belka and Strelka got back, and you can see here they're being held at the TASS agency to demonstrate for the entire world. And the idea was that the human flight into the outer space was in the preparation. So there were postcards and the children's book. And after those flights, they proved that they were able to carry progeny. And of course, mostly females were sent there because their urinate and fertility systems were separated. One of such puppies were sent to President Kennedy as one of the diplomatic gifts that was supposed to emphasize the win in the space race by the Soviet Union. These dogs ended their existence in the Aviation Institute and natural death. They were taxidermed that are now at the Museum of Cosmonautics, where they're at the backgrounds of Specs Rockets, at their honorable place. And there were over 40 suborbital flights, and the last one before Gagarin was the dog Zvezdochka, Little Star. The name was chosen by Gagarin because before that they were like superstitious, lucky, and things like this. And Zvezdochka, Little Star became really famous, especially since it luckily came back. And there were candies with Zvezdochka, and here you see the monument to the Zvezdochka. The thing is that the monuments to the dogs came much later than that of other dogs, just in 2006. The important thing here is not just the dog itself, but the fact that the designers and scientists are also mentioned here, the ones that made its flight possible. And the thing is that the adoration and pride and joy for cosmic dogs was achieved by the scientists that could not be made not secretive. And so only in 2006 it was made not secret, and the book was published. It was called Soviet Space Dogs, and I was invited to collect all those stories that were dear to me since my childhood, and I'm really grateful to that publishing house. Now, you know, it is forbidden to be sent for higher animals to be sent to the outer space, so neither dogs nor monkeys are sent. And even when the cosmonauts or astronauts are asked, would you like to have a friend in this flight, they said they would not object to having a friend, but they would not like to torture a dog or any other creature. But I do believe that tardigrades do enjoy those space flights. Thank you very much, Alessa. Alessa, our next participant is Alexandra Dementieva, who is the multidisciplinary artist and the professor of Fine Arts Academy in Brussels. She has been combining in her installation music, cinema, dance, and other ideas. She is concerned with social psychology and theories of perception. Her works have been exhibited all over the world. Alexandra, you have the floor. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and to the audience that joined our conversation about the space exploration. And like we are now on the verge of all of us flying to Mars, and this is in fact the subject that has been always of interest to everybody, starting with the Neanderthals. As an artist, I've always been interested, and not just when I walk and do installations, mostly interactive installations. I dreamed that the person inside this installation would develop right away a desire to think what this installation is all about, and what was the dialogue that the artist meant to introduce. And that's why I use the interaction. It's not anything special for me, it's just one of the means of manufacturing that can assure the reaction, the immediate negative or positive reaction, and that creates a very interesting discussion or dialogue. And accordingly, this idea in and of itself that one could use various senses of people, not just our favorite sense, the vision. Through our vision, we evaluate our world, we can enjoy it or we can hate it, and we also can hear and touch. That is to say, we have usually 5 senses that allow us to associate with this world. I am interested if there are possibilities for installations to go further in our works. That is to sense not just 5 fields that were given to us, but many more, especially since, according to the latest, or not even really latest research, there is an opinion that we have many more senses. Like we have the sense of gravitation because we sense when we fall, and we don't only have tactile senses but also that of heat and cold. Their senses, except we don't not include them in those 5, but there are many more than 5. And if we can use them one way or another in our artwork, this is really of interest to me. And accordingly, the outer space for me is not just the idea of another world, but this is also an idea that symbolically provides an opportunity just to dream or to come up, invent something. And one of those things, which, and I will work with that quite frequently, is the image of an extraterrestrial, of an alien. That, of course, would be myself, from the planet Kquaanian. Of course, it's all, you know, made up, but this is the planet of a civilization that is on the 3rd level of civilizations, meaning the civilization that uses the energy, in fact, of the entire universe. And the idea is that basically we need to talk about the civilization, not like the ones that we read about sci-fi, that they need to conquer something, that they're at war with some other civilizations, or concentrate on the use of some resources. But the idea is that the civilization is at the process of the archivizations of memory and encounter of new forms, but at this time at the universe level. So the idea of the symbiosis, or like the fusion of the DNA of the Homo Sapiens and the Kquaanian, which would be myself, and we, our civilization tries to understand the way the human civilization works, that limits itself to 5 senses and refuses to recognize whatever happens around at the level of the animals that Alessa was talking about, because the animals do not have the same narrative basis that are at the possession of people, therefore they're lower creatures for us, even though in theory they're just the ones who live in different world. And that brings to mind von Uxel, who was one of the first, not, even though not the first. He started talking about the Umwelt, which is the world, the reality that is created by each living creature inside oneself, that is to say, using one's own senses. And he likes to cite examples, the tick that has just three senses from the reality, but they're sufficient. It feels heat, it feels movement, and accordingly, after it gets onto the skin, it feels blood, So those are three senses that are entirely logical from the point of view of the civilization for a tick to exist in the form that it possesses, and the same processes would happen to them as to everybody else, as they live, they die, they multiply, and accordingly the Kquaanians, and once again talking about the tardigrades, what's interesting about Kquaanian civilizations, that there are these huge tardigrades essentially. In their form, morphologically, we look like tardigrades when with our face, but we have very many senses, very many overfloating senses of reality, feelings of reality, and that's one of the things that allows us to be not just in a certain harmony with nature and with things around us, but also to understand the very same animals, relatively to have a feeling of aggression or the sensation or that they have towards us, or sensation of friendship, of sympathy or likeness. All that takes place in a very different level. Same thing as the Kquaanian civilization never had any wars in their history, because it's an opportunity to exist at an electrical level, because their neurons, they talk through electrical impulses, and they can read the condition of our brain and know in advance if the human being, or rather the Kquaanian, has yet another a question towards you, or indifference, or if it's an aggression. One could a priori overcome that aggression, so there would be no conflicts whatsoever. And ultimately, the Kquaanians are the largest animals, largest creature on the planet Kquaan. At the same time, they are in the full fusion with whatever is around us. And even if we remember Steiner, who at a certain time had a theory that the civilizations who lived on Earth, they have not always been like ourselves, and concerned with financial and economical basis the way we are, and having some money or some metals as the value. The Steiner had the theory that prior to that, even before the Greeks and before the Atlantis, there were civilizations that had very developed various senses, and they could not only understand birds, they could feel how the earth turns, how the constellations change, and in fact they existed with the unison of what was around them. And accordingly, if you're in such a state, you could call it beatitude or bliss. It's not necessary to do any kind of building or constructions, but unfortunately we don't have traces of that civilization, but it might have very well existed. Accordingly, from the point of view of the Kquaanians, how they differ from people, it's that we live much longer, because we have an opportunity to go into an abiosis. We can go into hibernation for a long time. We have opportunities. There are some Kquaanians that could exist practically in vacuum, but not for a really long time, much like a spaceship. But that could be in vacuum, like for 30 seconds or so. As they said, a person dies after 30 seconds in vacuum, but Kquaanians could be in vacuum for 10 hours or so, and coming back to the tardigrades, because they're Earth creatures, our locals, and we try to establish a certain contact with them, but for now we haven't been established the common language, but we are still searching for that. Nevertheless, the tardigrades of the kind that exist on Earth, they're like Tamagotchi, the Pokemons, these toys that are given to the children, that are given by the Kquaanians to the children, and children, they have to take care of them all the time. And also why tardigrades, because if the child, God forbid, forgets to feed the tardigrade, it could go into hibernation and then revive. So those are our toys. But once again, that's no good, because we do not believe that they are below us. It's just that we have this certain agreement, relationship with them. Another thing that I would like to say is, of course, that when we have an opportunity to use many various senses, not just 5, accordingly, we have an opportunity to create the works of art, or just works that would not provide us just an aesthetic impulse, but would impart certain senses to us, certain atmosphere of immersion that would allow us people to release, to liberate some other kind of senses. And what else? I'm really glad to see Andrey here today, because whenever we see all his performances with all kinds of diversity, forms and variety, it's really important for me, something that gives to us all an opportunity that probably such interesting personages, subjects can exist, not just like Andrey himself. Alexandra, thank you very much. Our next participant is indeed Andrey Partienev, who is an artist, a sculptor, an experimentator, an author of experimental and provocative installations. Bartenev has been known since 1990s as a performance man and master of installation. He perceived the world through contrast of colors and volumes, textures and surfaces, and active interplay of materials and shapes. In 2002, he works at a performance entitled Stairways of Red in the summer center of Waterville. Then he participated in the Warning Band with the installation Alien, yes. And then he got the alternative Miss World participant as Miss UFO. Now we'll see his Burning Man performance images from that. Yes, and the name of this performance was Aliens, question mark, yes, exclamation point. Andrey, you have the word. Good evening, my friends. I welcome all the presenters, and I'm grateful to Alexandra to mention my modest creative work. I've always sensed and known that the aim of art is to form the question, not pose the questions by any means, but just formulate the questions. And these formulated questions, that's where the art creates these huge platforms of questions. And in this, by doing this, art widens the borders of our evolutionary consciousness, and that's my evolutionary mission, is to form a question. And in my performances that I've been doing for years and years, is the subject of alien civilizations, meeting of extraterrestrial. I call them extrater, and all the performances about that is to satisfy the viewers' passion for the contact. They want contact. Bartenev gives them contact, so this is the best example. A home pot, you can put salt or pepper inside, and that would be your first contact with extraterrestrials. So to answer the Shakespeare questions, to be or not to be, for the context, the Bartenev's answer is Yorick. Of course, it's to be for the context. So why I create performances dedicated to extraterrestrial civilization and creatures and extraterrestrials, because I want to evoke the intuition in my viewers, that part of it that is responsible for this all galactic interaction, so that the person could not, wouldn't feel that he is a function of a government, that he is a function of his family self, that he is a bio device that cooks at the kitchen, that he would not think that he is the function that is meant to earn money. Through my performance, I press the button that suddenly and naturally opens the chakras, and the person starts intuitively feel him or herself as a part of the all cosmos, all universe flower. But the most important thing in my performance is a huge gallery of questions. And maybe one of those questions sounds as follows. Maybe we, with all our galaxies, with all the system of our galaxies, are just an old woolen sock, and black holes are just rhythms of the threads that are knitted, but huge, all-seeing creator of everything. And that is of my interest. And this is the question that I would like to translate to my spectator. And of course, in my performances, I try to talk about the fact that there is a totally different form of travel. Is when the essence travels from one body to a different body. And if now we don't speak aloud about that, if we don't register facts of traveling of essence from one body to another, probably because it is done under great secret, greatly under great secret, not transparently, but it doesn't mean that it does not exist. And so our conscious develops questions to which we don't even try to find an answer, but those questions are the ones that change us, and this is the thing that I also try to stick into my performances and to convey that through my extraterrestrials. And probably this is all that I would like to say, and the last part of my performance would be this pot-like creature, an extraterrestrial that I made out of clay, being here in Spain. Well, and that's it. I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you very much, Andrey. You're welcome. And now we'll return for a little bit to the dogs. Alessa, how come that the Soviet scientists sent to the first suborbital flight dogs proper, whereas the Americans did that with monkeys? Alessa, could you unmute? To begin this, before I turn to the dogs, Andrey, all my respect to you. You are so close to Tsiolkovsky, whose works I've read all the time. His work, brain, and passion. their passion. He is talking about film director of the universe, because he said that we do not see higher creatures because we don't yet have disability, and he also believed that people do not die. He had the theory of parapsychism because they break into smallest particles and then they exchange those particles. Therefore, we should not offend themselves when people torture each other or kill each other. It means that this particle of the sacrifice of the victim might end up with the torturer. So thank you so much. And if we are going back to the dogs, this is of course a very important thing, because it is considered that monkeys and straw are closer to people, but it's harder to work with monkeys, with apes. And in fact, the Americans started working with monkeys approximately at the same time, and even a little bit earlier than Soviet researchers. And when the question was whom to choose, the memories of the scientists of Lysenko, it was that they went to the circus and then they learned from the tamers, they learned that monkeys were really nervous creatures. They get upset, they don't survive, tolerate vaccinations well, and that was the reason that in 1969 the Congress of the United States forbade to use monkeys for cosmic purposes, which was fair. On the other hand, it was easier to work with the dogs. The dogs are sensitive, but not as much as monkeys, not as nervous. And also there was the tradition of the academician Pavlov, who learned the reflexes, and we have this intimidating place where he conducted his experiments. It's impossible to watch even now without shudder the way the dogs reacted to the bell and secreted the stomach juices. And the thing is that it's not just so materialistic a method, but the thing is that they were trying to create a person who was able to have this conditional and unconditional reflexes, and to be a person that was drawn to us by Andrey, like there is a bell, we produce the stomach juices and we go to work. So we no longer give a thought about who we are, about how the questions are worded, we just follow our reflexes. Although in 1970s, the Soviet Union started the program called Beyond and invited, in the midst of the Cold War, American scientists to participate in this program. So the most expensive part, the rocket, was paid for by the Soviet Union. And in the 70s, they started experiments with monkeys that had been forbidden by that time in the USA. So Russian and American scientists started preparing pairs of monkeys, sent them to outer space, then implanted the electrodes into their bodies, and it was written that it was impossible to look without pictures on those bodies with electrodes, and they overloaded them with assignments. And there was academician Firsov who worked with monkeys and learned higher nervous activities in monkeys. And it was in 1997 because the monkey Multik died, and at the same time the Congress and the Society for Humane Treatment of Animals said that one should start, and after that even Russia stopped doing those experiments, and now they cannot be affected. And I was in the city of Alupka, where it was moved from Sukhumi, the zoo of those creatures, and there is a monument for monkeys I showed you the monument for the dog Strelka and the Museum of Cosmonautics. And if you let me, I'll show you now this monument to the monkeys, because I believe that there is a certain like piercing, passionate moment. I'll share the screen with you in a moment. This is called the way it looks now. This the monument of Pavlov, always with the dog, and this is a drawing as how the experiments with dogs were conducted, and this is the model, wood model, still acting and absolutely horrific, and those are experiments of Firsov, and the collaborators provided services of their family of children to communicate with monkeys, and this is the program of Beyond, and this is the monument of the returnable part of the rocket, and inside that we have two monkeys. They flew in pairs, but they were separated. And these monkeys, I would so much like for them to revive, much like tardigrades, and get back to us. I'm not going to torture your heart anymore, but we do have monkeys and monkeys. And then again, at the height of Cold War, these two programs united for mutual work. Thank you, Alessa. Alexandra, you and Matthew discussed the tardigrades today, their ability to survive in extreme conditions. How the study of tardigrades influence your creative process, Alexandra? Well, to begin with, I'm interested in what's going on, happening with tardigrades, and what is studied by scientists currently, and why the tardigrades are these undying creatures. And one should add that they have existed on Earth for over 500 million years, and this special organism that they have eyes, not exactly eyes, but those elements that act as our eyes. They have a stomach. They have a system like genitalia. That is to say, they are quite complex, even though they're really tiny, like not more than 5 millimeters in length. And accordingly, when one studies them, first of all, it's a really interesting sensation, because we always think that what we see is what is, and like tardigrades, they are, but we do not see them. And when one unexpectedly sees them through a microscope, rather powerful microscope, a professional microscope, one could see that there is a wondrous creature that has 4 pairs of extremities with like nails or claws. We don't know how and whether they communicate between each other, because usually we see them in the same space, but without any contact without them. It's just like the question of luck, whether we could see their contact, but at the same time we could realize that those tardigrades, they're really material, they're really animals that at a certain point then can go into hibernation or anabiosis, when thanks to the fact that they have this incredible characteristic of their proteins, that like they lose fluids entirely, which makes for them possible to survive in any extreme situations. And at the same time, those proteins helps protect them from the high levels of radiation, of drying, of boiling, and different factors that they endure. And when they look at them, you understand that the world doesn't end by what we see, and it goes much further. And it's interesting for me as to how, for instance, one could give an opportunity for everybody else to see, everyone else to see this world, not just from the biological point of view, or when we do physics on the atomic level and the particles of which we exist, but the tardigrades are this possible option that could be shown. One could tell about them, and they could become a subject of some narrative. And it's not like it doesn't exist because we do not see. It does exist if we apply even a slight effort. So those are stories, they are fantasies about how they live, about what they do, is one of the possible moments to expand our vision. And then certainly we also give a certain anthropological aspect to tardigrade, not just tardigrade, but to everything when we come up with something, when we think about something, and animals whom we treat as people to a certain extent. On the other hand, we have very many functions that are really similar or different, so we could allow this liberty to ourselves. And also this is very interesting from the point of view of inventing things, of how those things can invent and what world we can create with their help. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Matthew, what do you think about the intersection about art and science in the studies of black holes? Matthew, you have the word.
Thank you, Natalia. I think fundamentally, art and science are driven by the same thing, creativity. And I think, like the tardigrade, the black hole is so extreme. It's beyond the edge of our expectation and understanding. The black hole is past the edge of our physics understanding, and tardigrades is past the edge of our biological understanding. And it just blows the mind. And I think things like that are off the scale is so new and different from our experiences and different from our understandings and theories. It can't help but spur the imagination and spur more creativity. And Alexandra is right on it with tardigrades, and I am just so excited to see what she's going to produce from that, the direction she's going to go. It really fuels the imagination and therefore art, these extremes. I think it can't help it. Yeah. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Андрей,
Thank you very much. Andrey, today you mentioned the intuition. Is intuition as a mechanism of a certain extraterrestrial regulation of our desires, Andrey? Or yeah, right? I am trying to bring us to that, to the fact that our intuition is a really unresearched field, and Tsiolkovsky, who fought the passion and came up with calculations and calculated how one could calculate the passion. I believe he is not the only one who came up with this thought. Any extraterrestrial civilization could come up with a formula of how to regulate human intuition and how to translate certain aims through that. There are two theories that dominate our civilization. One is everything is as it is, and the other theory is nothing is as it seems. And so these two extremities, two verges, are washed by the river of intuition. And if we look into the bottom of intuition, as it were, and ask whose will is hidden in the depth whose desire is hidden in the depths of intuition, what answer would we hear? If now we turn to the statistic and say that so many men and so many women live on our planet, and how many representatives of other civilizations live on our planet, we don't know this answer, but it does mean that they're not there. And so such extraterrestrials, such retranslators that could control and affect our intuition and use it in their practical purposes, they exist, whether they're visible or not. It could be 1 or 2 for 10,000 people. So those extraterrestrials are regulators of our intuition. The extraterrestrial that affect and intensifies our intuition. How does that work? This is a really interesting question. What if this is the one for every 10,000 of people? So the inner circle that is close to this extraterrestrial, do they get the greater effect and they hear it better, and therefore they follow this extraterrestrial field better? And those people who live further, like at the rims of these craters, they're like weak, and other people and all the creative creatures, they deal with passions one way or another, and with intuitions, their practice is based on them. And those maximum adepts that are subject to the interplanetary regulation. And this is probably all that I want you to say. Once again, I'm not posing the questions. I started my presentation with the purposes of art, with forming the question, not to pose it, and not in order to receive the answer, but for the question to exist as an independent form, as a full-blooded creature. And maybe just by its existence and presence, this question will form the future answers that will come, form the bridge towards this question, and they will create the spatial slice of our evolution. Thank you very much, Andrey. The last question would probably be to Alesya. We'll come back to the ideology. In your book, you called the Cosmos dogs the first pop stars of the Soviet Union. How were the images of heroic dogs were used for propaganda? How it influenced the ideology? And what happened after the space race had been over? Right. Most certainly in the totalitarian state, there could not be such thing as pop culture. Of course, there were favorite actors, favorite performance, but the Soviet people or the collective was responsible for all that. But dogs, since on the one hand they were very individualized, on the other hand they could not have human identity, they could have been endowed with this glory, and it was not threatening at all. On the other hand, with the space dog, they rehearsed the propaganda of the cosmonauts. In 2 days we'll celebrate the flight of Yuri Gagarin to cosmos. The fact they did the photographs, the fact they arranged meetings in kindergartens, in factories, how they sent it to other countries, other entities. It was practiced on dogs to the level that when Gagarin ended up in United Kingdom, the people who were meeting them in London at the airport by the crowd, and a prime minister said, it's a good thing they did not send the dog, otherwise the entire city of London would have stopped. So of course, in a totalitarian state, it is easy to use animals, which does not preclude love enjoy of dealing with them, but I would also like to join the question mentioned by Andrey. I would like to say that artists possess an incredible ability to form the questions that would really allow later achieve some kind of answer, and very many scientific discoveries are achieved by that. And the secret of science fiction inspired all the cosmic programs, and then they realized that Pushkin was wrong. Unlike Jules Verne, we need another system, and then Herbert H. Wells is wrong, so we need another system. Those science fiction programs were counted, and now we need to consider tardigrades who came through the black holes. We need to consider this, and regarding the black holes and black holes, and I believe that the artists Lagina and Makarevich, they created the installation Black Matter in London, and the scientists from the Greenwich Observatory came to see this installation. Now I get it. Now I understand what I have been doing, because sometimes the metaphors are rendered through the visual images, and that would be the privilege of an artist who who extraterrestrials among us, or extraterrestrials, how they Andrey told them, I just believe that have the same stamina as tardigrades, and they will be able to survive in any continent, on any planet. So my vote for the tardigrades and for cosmic dogs, and also for cosmic rats and cockroaches. And if we talk about the cosmologists, the cosmic artists, further up, that we would be revived from the cosmic dust, so we will worship not just ancestors, but we will also worship every tardigrade, every cosmic dog, every monkey that perished, and every geckon, because they are a part of our creature. Thank you very much, Alessa. Time of our discussion comes to the end. Thank you very much to all the presenters. I would like to add something to what Alessa said. Now we heard the manifesto of the new intergalactic humanism. We are on the verge of new era, and I keep talking about that all the time, because by now the humankind is so preoccupied with intelligence, and that's where its entire attention is focused, the artificial intelligence, but we still have not figured out with what we actually have. And for the future, we need to build some new humanistic rules and regulations that Alessa has mentioned when dealing with artificial intellect. This is just my small addition, a great addition. I believe we will meet regarding those, regarding that manifesto. And will the tardigrades be signatories in the manifesto? Of course they will be signatories. What else they could do? Thank you very much for all the participants, and to Leonardo and to Laser Talks, and Silent Media Art Lab, and Ground Salyanka, and Kolodzei Art Foundation, and to our audience. Thank you very much. Now I suggest that we continue our discussion in the future. And now at the end of the discussion, we will show you a small 5-minute video by Anna Franz, and silent video. Thank you very much.
Еще раз огромное спасибо всем.
Once again, thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.